should have turned back the moment I saw the sign. It was old, leaning slightly to one side, half covered in creeping moss. The words "Welcome to Black Tide Cove" were barely visible beneath layers of salt-stained grime. Below it, someone had scratched a warning into the wood, letters rough and uneven, like they had been carved in a hurry. The sea never forgets. I didn't know what it meant at the time. I laughed it off, thinking it was some local superstition meant to scare tourists. But now, looking back, I wonder if it was a message left for me. A final chance to turn around before it was too late. Black Tide Cove was smaller than I expected. A few clusters of weathered buildings clung to the rocky coastline, their paint stripped by wind and salt. The streets were empty, save for the occasional figure peering from behind lace curtains. Even in daylight, the town felt wrong. Too quiet, too still. I parked my car in front of the only inn I could find, the Mariner's Rest. The wooden sign above the door creaked in the wind, swinging back and forth as if it was whispering some secret I wasn't meant to hear. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of damp wood and something faintly metallic, like rust or old blood. An elderly woman sat behind the counter, her fingers drumming lightly against the surface. Her eyes, sharp and sunken, flickered over me with something close to suspicion. "You're not from around here," she said flatly. "No," I admitted, brushing the damp off my jacket. "I'm a journalist. Nathan Hale." Her lips pressed into a thin line, as if I had said something offensive. "I'm researching coastal folklore," I continued, forcing a smile. "Urban legends, ghost stories, that sort of thing. Thought this place might have a few interesting tales." Silence. Then, without a word, she slid a rusted key across the counter. "Rooms upstairs. Into the hall." I took the key, feeling the cold weight of it in my palm. "Anything you'd recommend I check out? Places tied to local legends?" The woman's fingers stopped drumming. She leaned forward just slightly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Stay away from the Titapools." A chill ran down my spine. Before I could ask why, the door behind me creaked open, letting in a gust of salty wind. An old fisherman shuffled inside, his face deeply lined, his clothes smelling of the sea. He glanced at me, then at the woman, his expression darkening. "Another one," he muttered. The woman shot him a warning look, but he ignored her, stepping closer. His gaze locked onto mine, and for the first time since arriving, I felt something close to fear. "You don't belong here," he said, "and you'd be smart to leave before the tide changes." I wanted to ask what he meant, but he turned and walked away before I could speak. The woman sighed, rubbing her temples. "Don't listen to him," she said. "Old men love their ghost stories." But as I climbed the stairs to my room, I couldn't shake the feeling that his warning wasn't just an old man's rambling. It was something else, a promise. And outside, beyond the window, the sea whispered my name. The town of Black Tide Cove felt stuck in time. Wooden houses, their paint peeled from years of salty air, leaned toward narrow streets. The scent of brine and rotting seaweed lingered everywhere, mixing with the distant cries of gulls. I had only been here a day, but the weight of the town's silence was pressing down on me. I sat at the lone diner near the harbor, nursing a cup of lukewarm coffee. The locals barely acknowledged me. Conversations died the moment I walked in, eyes flicking toward me, then away, like I wasn't supposed to be here. It wasn't hostility, just wariness. I needed answers. An old fisherman sat hunched in a corner, his skin like weathered leather, his gray beard stained with tobacco. He stirred his tea absent-mindedly, staring out the window toward the ocean. I decided to take my chances. "Excuse me, sir," I said, sliding into the seat across from him. "I was wondering if you could tell me about the Titapools." His stirring stopped. The spoon clinked against the ceramic. He didn't look at me. "There's nothing to tell," he muttered. I leaned in. "I heard stories. About the drowned ones." The fisherman's jaw tensed. His fingers twitched, gripping the spoon like he wanted to snap it in half. Then, slowly, he turned to me. His eyes were pale, almost milky, like he had spent too many years staring at the sea. "You should leave," he said. "The Titapools aren't for outsiders." I waited, letting the silence stretch between us. His gaze flickered to the other patrons. No one was looking at us, but I could feel the tension in the room, the kind that made your skin crawl. "You don't believe the stories, do you?" I asked. The fisherman scoffed. "Belief's got nothing to do with it." He stood abruptly, tossing a few crumpled bills onto the table. Before he walked out, he muttered something under his breath. Asterisk, the sea doesn't forget those who listen. Asterisk. That night, I made my way toward the Tidapools. The sky was a deep shade of blue, the horizon barely visible in the dim moonlight. The ocean stretched endlessly, its waves lapping gently against the jagged rocks. The tide had begun to recede, revealing pools of still water trapped between blackened stones. I crouched near the largest one, my breath misting in the cold air. The surface of the pool reflected the sky, the stars scattered across the water like tiny lights. I studied my reflection, watching as the ripples distorted my face. Then I saw it, a shape just beneath the surface. I froze. My mind scrambled for a logical explanation, maybe a fish or seaweed shifting with the current. But the shape didn't move naturally. It was still, watching. I swallowed hard. My own reflection wavered slightly, but something was wrong. The delay. My lips weren't moving, but my reflections were. I stumbled back, heart pounding. The water remained still, yet I could feel something just beyond the edge of my vision. A presence. A whisper drifted through the air, so soft, I almost thought I imagined it. Asterisk, come closer. Asterisk, a cold shiver ran down my spine. I turned on my heel and hurried back up the path toward town, my footsteps echoing against the damp rocks. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I already knew I wasn't alone. The Tidapools looked ordinary at first, just shallow pockets of seawater trapped between jagged rocks, reflecting the gray sky above. Nothing special, nothing strange. But as I crouched down and stared into the still water, something in my gut twisted. The reflection wasn't quite right. I was alone on the shore, yet the water felt crowded, like something else was looking back at me. The waves whispered softly behind me, rising and falling in a rhythm that almost sounded deliberate, like breathing. I shook off the unease and pulled out my notebook, jotting down observations. Tidapools at dusk. Water unnaturally still. No fish, no movement. Locals fear this place. Why? A gust of wind rolled in from the sea, carrying the sharp scent of salt and decay. I zipped up my jacket, glancing over my shoulder. The town was just a cluster of dim lights in the distance. No one had followed me here. At least, no one living. I exhaled and turned back to the water. That's when I saw it. The reflection lingered. For a heartbeat too long, my image remained in the water even after I moved. A perfect copy of me, frozen in place, staring straight ahead with an expression I wasn't making. I blinked. The reflection caught up, moving with me again. A trick of the light, I told myself. Or maybe my eyes were tired. But my hands were cold and clammy, my pulse a little too fast. I wanted to leave. Then I heard it. A whisper, low and breathy, curling up from the Tidapools. Asterisk Nathan. Asterisk. I staggered backward, my boots scraping against wet stone. The whisper had come from the water, not the wind. I was sure of it. I scanned the empty shoreline, my breath unsteady. There was no one here, just me, and the voice. Slowly, I stepped forward again, peering into the Tidapool, heart pounding. The water was still, glassy, and dark. But deep in its reflection, deeper than the pool should have been, I saw something shift, a shadow rising. The wind howled suddenly, sharp and cold, and the waves crashed violently against the shore. I stumbled back as seawater sprayed across the rocks. When I looked again, the Tidapool was empty. I didn't stay to question it. I grabbed my notebook and left, moving quickly across the shore, the wet sand sucking at my boots. The whispers were gone, but the feeling wasn't. Something had been there, watching, waiting, and it knew my name. The town of Black Tide Cove is strange, but it's in the silence that I feel its true weight. The sort of silence that clings to your skin, pressing down on your chest like the ocean's own hand, keeping you from breathing easy. I came here for a story, sure, An article about urban legends, the kind of thing that would make a good footnote in a book. But as the days drag on, the stories seem to come alive in ways I never expected. And then Eliza vanished. I first noticed her on the second day I was in town. She was the kind of girl who always had a distant look in her eyes, like she was staring at something just beyond the horizon, something only she could see. I tried to speak to her a few times, but her answers were short, her eyes always shifting toward the sea. I didn't think much of it at first. She was just another quiet local, the kind who didn't ask questions, didn't offer answers. That was the way of Black Tide Cove. But then, on the fourth night, I saw her again. It was after sunset, the air thick and salt-laden, the sky bruised purple with the first hints of darkness. I was walking down the main street of the town when I saw Eliza near the edge of the Tidapools, standing on a jagged rock just where the sea meets the land. It's a dangerous place to stand. Sharp rocks, deep water, and the waves that never quite behave like they should. But there she was, gazing into the water, her back to me. I called her name once, but she didn't answer. Curiosity got the best of me. I walked closer, my shoes crunching against the sand and gravel, but by the time I reached the rocks, Eliza had disappeared. The Tidapools were empty, just dark water reflecting the sky. The only sound was the constant crash of the waves. I stood there for a long moment, staring out at the water, wondering if I had imagined her. It was then that I heard the whisper, soft at first, like wind brushing against my ear. But there was something unmistakable about it, something deliberate. It was her voice. "Come closer," it said. I froze. My heart thudded in my chest, a violent beat that seemed to echo across the sea. I turned around, half expecting to see her standing behind me, but there was no one. The whispers came again, louder this time. "Come closer." I stepped back. The voice wasn't like anything I had ever heard. It wasn't the voice of a person. It felt like it was coming from the sea itself, from something beneath it, something ancient that had no business speaking in the language of men. I turned and made my way back to town, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. I couldn't explain why, but something about that moment felt off, wrong in a way that gnawed at me. The next morning, I woke to a new kind of silence. It was the kind of silence that pressed against your eardrums, the kind that makes you wonder if something is missing, if something vital has disappeared. I heard the door to my room creak open just after sunrise. The innkeeper stood at the threshold, looking grim. He didn't say much, just a nod to the shore. "Eliza's gone," he muttered. I thought it was some sort of sick joke. People go missing in small towns all the time. Someone gets drunk, takes a wrong turn, doesn't come back. But this wasn't like that. The sea had taken her. That's what they said. I couldn't believe it at first. How could she be gone? She was just standing by the rocks the night before. But when I asked around, it was as if no one cared. No one seemed worried. It was as if they expected it to happen. "Stay away from the Tidapools," the innkeeper warned me quietly, his voice shaking for the first time since I met him. "The sea doesn't like visitors who linger too long." The words felt like an old story, a warning passed down for generations, something meant to keep people from getting too close to what they didn't understand. But this was real. Eliza had disappeared, and the tide had claimed her. I asked more people about her, but it was as if she had never existed. The fishermen muttered under their breath, eyes darting to the horizon, avoiding my gaze. "She's gone," they said. "The sea doesn't give up what it takes." That night, I walked back to the Tidapools. The water was lower than usual, the rocks exposed, and I found myself standing at the same spot where Eliza had been just days before. And that's when I heard it, a whisper, barely audible over the crashing waves. It wasn't my name. It wasn't hers either. It was something else, a voice with no face. The voice that had called me before. "Come closer," it said again, and this time I couldn't resist. I stepped forward, my feet dragging me closer to the water, as if the sea had reached up and taken control of my body. The whispering grew louder, swirling around me, calling my name, urging me to walk into the water. I stopped just before the waves lapped at my ankles, the cold biting into my skin. I stood there for a moment, staring into the depths, and in that moment I saw something I couldn't explain. A figure, a shadow, moving just below the surface. I blinked, and it was gone. But I knew what I had seen. Eliza wasn't gone. She was still there beneath the water waiting. I turned and ran back to town, my heart hammering, my breath ragged in the salty air. The town had grown quieter since her disappearance, as if the very air held its breath. Everyone seemed to know, but no one spoke. The sea had taken one of its own, and it would take again. And then I realized the truth. Eliza had never truly left. She was still out there, in the water, calling for others to join her. And that's when I knew the town's stories were more than just myths. The sea had a hunger, and it wasn't done feeding yet. It's strange how quickly the sea gets under your skin. At first, I thought the rumors, the whispers, were just that, nothing more than old superstition, stories that people tell to keep tourists away. But now, every night, they call to me. The sea's voice, soft but clear, like a murmur in the back of my mind. A murmur that pulls at something deep inside me. I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to give in to whatever madness was slowly sinking into my thoughts. But that night, something changed. The sun had long since disappeared, and the fog crept back over the town, thick as ever. The streets were quiet, eerily so. Not a soul walked them at this hour. I had walked to the shore again, not out of any particular need, but because it felt like the only thing to do. The sea always seems to call when the night is at its darkest, and the fog rolls in thick enough to make everything feel like a dream. I stood there, my boots sinking slightly into the wet sand, watching the waves crash against the rocks. I could hear it again, that whisper, low and faint. At first, I thought it was the wind, the creak of the old wooden buildings behind me. But no, this was different. Nathan, I froze, my breath catching in my throat. There was again, my name, spoken by the sea. Not loud, never loud, but there, clear, almost like it was right beside me. I should have turned and run. Maybe I would have, if I'd had any sense left in me. But something made me stay, something I couldn't explain. The water churned, the tide slowly creeping back from the rocks, pulling away from the shore as though it were retreating into itself. I felt my heart race, but I couldn't move. Not yet. Nathan, the voice called again. This time it felt closer. I swallowed hard, trying to shake the sensation of being watched. Was I losing my mind? Was the isolation finally taking its toll on me? I squinted into the dark waters, trying to see what was beyond the waves. The fog had thickened, and the world felt small, confined, as if it was closing in on me. Then I saw something, a figure standing just at the edge of the tidipools, barely visible against the waves. I blinked, but it was still there, tall, thin, and utterly still. A person? No, it wasn't right. There was something wrong about how they stood, the way they didn't move even as the waves crashed around them. Come closer, the voice urged, now no longer a whisper but a low hum, resonating from the very air around me. You must see. I couldn't breathe. My mind was racing, thoughts colliding with each other, unsure whether to believe or run. Something tugged at my chest, as if the voice wasn't just in my ears but deep in my soul, pulling me forward. I didn't want to go closer. I shouldn't go closer. But my feet, they moved on their own. Before I could stop myself, I was walking toward the water. Nathan! The voice was almost pleading now, its tone edged with an emotion I couldn't quite place. Desperation? Longing? I couldn't tell. But it wasn't like the others. It was more human, more alive. I reached the edge of the tidipools, where the water swirled in lazy circles, licking at the black rocks beneath. And there, standing among the rocks, was the figure, still motionless, waiting. It was too far away to see clearly, but I felt it. It was watching me. The air grew colder, colder than it should have been for such a mild night. My breath was coming out in sharp bursts now, and I felt a chill creep into my bones. The figure didn't move. It didn't have to. I could feel it, though, something inside me that urged me to step closer. The voice, like a soft command, guiding me forward. I took one more step, and then another. Suddenly, the fog parted just enough for me to catch a glimpse of the figure's face. The sight hit me like a punch to the stomach. It was Eliza. Her face was pale, her eyes wide open but unseeing, staring into the abyss that stretched beyond the shore. Her lips moved as if trying to speak, but no words came out. I couldn't tell if she was calling to me or to someone else, but I could feel her there, yet not really there at all. Asterisk Eliza? Asterisk, my voice cracked in the cold night air. There was no response, just that empty, vacant stare. Then, the voice spoke again, softer, almost coaxing. Come. Join us? I recoiled, the blood draining from my face. I didn't know what was happening, but I felt it, the presence of something ancient, something wrong. The sea wasn't just a body of water. It was alive, it was watching. And it wanted me. Something shifted beneath the waves, a movement I couldn't understand. The figures in the water were no longer still. They were coming toward me, moving in the shadows of the mist. Slowly, deliberately. That's when I snapped back to reality. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest. The waves crashed violently behind me, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. As I reached the safety of the town, the air felt thick, suffocating. The sea still called, but I was far enough now to be out of its reach, I thought. I wanted to scream, to tell someone, anyone, what I had seen. But who would believe me? I had heard the voice. I had heard the caller, and now, no matter where I went, it would always follow. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was running out of time. The whispers had been getting louder, more insistent. It wasn't just the wind anymore, or the creaking of old wood as the tide rolled in. There was something else in it now. Something alive. Every night it seemed to call to me, pulling me closer to the water, urging me to listen. But I'd ignored it long enough. I had to know what was waiting for me beneath the surface of those tidipools. I had to prove these legends wrong, or at the very least understand why no one would talk about them. The night I decided to go to the beach was different from the others. There was an urgency in the air, something heavy like the sky was holding its breath. The fog rolled in thicker than usual, creeping down from the cliffs like fingers reaching out, touching everything in its path. The moon was almost full, casting a pale light over the sea, making everything look surreal, like a scene from a dream. I made my way down the winding path that led to the beach. The crunch of gravel beneath my boots was the only sound. No birds, no wind, just the endless hum of the ocean. I couldn't help but feel a chill creeping up my spine as I approached the tidipools. The locals had warned me, but the deeper I got into the mystery of Black Tide Cove, the more I had to push those warnings away. There was no way something supernatural could exist in a place like this, right? I stood on the edge of the rocks, staring out at the water. It was receding, just as it did every night, revealing the darkened pools and hidden depths. But tonight something was different. The sea wasn't just pulling back, it was pulling away from the land, as if it didn't want to touch the shore anymore. There was an unnatural stillness to it. I stepped forward, my boots crunching against the sharp rocks. My breath felt shallow, caught somewhere in the back of my throat. I had to be careful. The rocks were slippery, and one wrong move could send me tumbling into the water. But I couldn't stop now. I had come too far. As I moved deeper into the tidipools, I felt it. The air grew colder. The whispers started again, faint at first, like the wind through the trees. But then they grew louder. It was as if the sea was speaking to me, its voice rising from the water itself. Asterisk Nathan. Nathan, come closer, asterisk. My heart skipped a beat. The voice was soft, almost melodic, yet it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I should have turned around right then. I should have left. But I didn't. Something kept pulling me forward, an invisible force like an unseen hand wrapping around my chest, urging me onward. I squinted through the fog, trying to make sense of the shapes emerging from the darkness. At first, I thought they were just shadows, figures in the distance, barely noticeable against the swirling mist. But as I took another step, I saw them more clearly. They were standing in the water, perfectly still. Their bodies were distorted, like they had been submerged for too long, their movements jerky, unnatural. But their faces were the worst part. They had no eyes, only empty sockets, staring straight at me. And then I saw her. Eliza. Her face was pale, waterlogged, her once bright eyes now hollow and dark. She stood among the figures, but she wasn't moving. She was watching me. "Help me." The words formed in my mind, not spoken aloud, but whispered through the crashing waves. I knew it wasn't just her voice. It was the caller's. I froze, my body rigid with fear. This was real. This wasn't just some old myth or superstition. The drowned ones were real, and they were waiting for me. The tide was receding even farther now. The figures were closing in, their movements slow but deliberate. They seemed to glide across the rocks, the sound of their wet feet slapping against the stones sending chills through my veins. I could hear their breathing, or was it mine? Echoing in the hollow space between us. Each step felt heavier, as if the earth itself was resisting my movements. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream, but my feet were frozen to the ground, held in place by something deeper than fear. Suddenly, the whispers became louder, more urgent. The air felt thick with their voices, pressing in from all sides. Asterisk, come to us, Nathan. Come home. Asterisk. A cold hand brushed against my leg, a chill so deep it felt like my skin would crack. I looked down to see a figure, one of the drowned ones, reaching for me. Its fingers were webbed and pale, the skin stretched tight over bones that shouldn't have been moving. It grabbed hold of my ankle, its grip icy and relentless. Asterisk, no! Asterisk, I shouted, trying to pull away, but the creature's grip tightened. The sea was closing in, rising faster than it should have. I could hear it now, the roar of the waves, as if the ocean itself were claiming me. I screamed, yanking myself free, stumbling backwards over the rocks. The water rushed toward me, swallowing the land. I turned, desperate to escape, but the tide was already here, rolling in with a vengeance, pulling everything back into its depths. The last thing I saw before the darkness took me was Eliza, her face twisted in a silent scream, reaching out with a hand I couldn't quite touch. And then, the world went black. I don't know why I came back to the Tidipools. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was fear. But as soon as the clock struck midnight, I found myself standing on the jagged rocks, the cold sea breeze stinging my skin like a warning I refused to heed. I had to see it for myself. The truth, or whatever this town's madness called truth. The water was dark and quiet. It stretched out before me, silent except for the faint rhythmic lapping of the waves against the rocks. The moon hung heavy in the sky, a pale, watchful eye that barely cut through the thick mist. I could feel it now, the pressure in the air, the unnatural stillness, as though the entire world was holding its breath. I couldn't even hear the town. The silence was suffocating. I stepped closer to the water, the ground beneath me slick with algae and seaweed. My shoes, soaked through in seconds, made no sound against the rocks. The only sound was that faint whispering, distant at first, like a half-forgotten memory tugging at the edge of my mind. It called to me, low and soft, almost like a voice I knew but couldn't remember. Come closer. My heart thundered in my chest. No, I thought, this is it. This is just the last of the madness. But my feet moved anyway. One step, then another. I couldn't stop. The tide was receding, pulling back like a breath being held, leaving the sandy floor exposed in dark, twisting patterns. I could see figures now, dark shapes standing in the shallow water. Too still, too unnatural. Their limbs were thin, their bodies bent at angles that didn't make sense. Their faces were shadowed, but I could feel their eyes. They were watching me. Eliza, I froze. I could feel her presence before I even saw her. The silhouette of a young girl standing among them, her form twisted and broken by the water, her head bent at an odd angle. Her eyes, black and empty, stared at me from across the shore. Her lips trembled, but no sound came. Asterisk Eliza. Asterisk, my voice broke the stillness, and I took a step forward, caught in the pull of something far greater than curiosity. That's when it happened. The first wave, gentle at first, began to creep back toward me, a quiet thread I hadn't noticed. And then, just as I blinked, it rushed toward me in an unnatural frenzy, faster than it had ever moved before. The water seemed to hiss as it broke against the rocks, the force pushing me back. I stumbled, but I didn't stop. "Come closer," the whisper grew louder. My name now a command. I was sinking. The sand beneath my feet was giving way, the water pulling at my legs like invisible hands. Cold. So cold. It was as though I had plunged into ice. My body screamed in protest, but the sea was stronger, tugging me toward it, deeper, darker. My chest tightened as I fought to breathe. My heart hammered in panic. I didn't know how deep the water was, how far it stretched beneath the surface. All I knew was that it was swallowing me whole. My legs were caught. The rocks beneath me were jagged, sharp against my skin. The water was rising, the whisper growing into a chorus. Hundreds of voices, all speaking my name. The figures, now fully illuminated in the dim light, began to move. They were coming for me. I looked back at Eliza's face, her eyes pleading now, a hollow emptiness behind them. She reached for me, her hand outstretched, fingers twisting in the water, but the current pulled her away, dragging her beneath the waves. The others followed. One by one, they disappeared beneath the surface, leaving only ripples behind. "Come home," the voice was now inside me, a cold chill crawling up my spine. I screamed, a sound of pure, primal fear. But the water swallowed it whole. I couldn't feel my body anymore, just the crushing pressure of the sea. The tide had taken me, dragging me into its depths. I had no control. I was helpless, drowning, but the voices kept pulling me deeper. I tried to fight, to scream, to claw my way back to the surface, but it was too late. The world above me began to fade. The moonlight vanished, and the water was all there was. A black void that swallowed everything. And then, just as I thought I couldn't go any deeper, a hand, cold and slick with water, reached out from the depths. It was Eliza. She took my hand. I couldn't pull away. I couldn't move. Her grip was unyielding, the pressure like iron. And for a fleeting moment, I thought I saw a glimpse of something beneath her face. A shadow, something darker than the water. And it grinned. I closed my eyes. The last thing I heard was the sea. It's time to go home. I woke up to an empty room. The kind of empty that felt wrong. The air was stale, untouched, as if no one had been here for a while. My belongings were scattered, the papers from my desk tossed aside in a hurried mess. But there was no sign of Nathan, no sign of him anywhere. I stood there for a moment, frozen, trying to piece together what had happened. The sheets on the bed were still warm, as if he had just gotten up, but there was no trace of him now. His bag, his notes, everything was gone. Only the damp scent of the sea lingered, thick and oppressive, like it had seeped into the walls themselves. I stepped out of the room and into the narrow hallway of the inn. The air was quieter than usual, almost unnaturally still. There was no sound of footsteps, no chatter from the few locals who normally gathered at the bar. It was as if the entire town had suddenly gone mute. I crossed the creaky floorboards, reaching the small desk where the innkeeper usually sat. The chair was empty, the room bathed in an eerie silence. I checked the guest book. Nathan's name was still there, though it had started to fade, like someone had tried to erase it. I frowned, turning the page to see if anyone had checked in recently. But the page was blank. I heard the creak of the door behind me and spun around. The innkeeper, a thin man with a face as weathered as the town itself, stood in the doorway, his eyes narrow, watching me. "He's gone," he said, his voice quiet but firm. I shook my head almost angrily. "What do you mean gone?" "He was here last night. He was just here. He couldn't have—" The innkeeper cut me off with a wave of his hand, stepping forward slowly, almost like he was afraid to speak too loudly. "The sea takes and the sea gives, but you don't want to know about the ones it takes." His gaze flickered nervously to the window, the fog thickening outside like a wall. "Where is he?" I asked, pressing. My heart began to pound, a rising dread in my chest, something I couldn't quite place. But the man didn't answer. He simply turned, his eyes avoiding mine as he went back to the back room. I followed him, desperate to get some answers, to shake the truth out of him. "What do you mean by that? Where is Nathan?" The others, they must know something, right? Someone has to know. The innkeeper stopped suddenly, his back to me. He didn't turn around when he spoke again. His voice was low, almost a whisper, as if afraid of being overheard. The town's been through it all before. Nothing new. Nothing changes. The room seemed to grow colder. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned to leave, but he grabbed my arm, his grip surprisingly firm for someone so frail. You won't find him, not unless you know how to listen, he said, his voice trembling with something between fear and warning. I ripped my arm from his hand, my chest tightening. I had to get out of there. The silence was suffocating, pressing in from all sides, and I couldn't breathe. I stormed out of the inn, running down the narrow street toward the beach. The fog was thicker now, swirling around me like a living thing. I couldn't even see my own feet as I walked. The wind howled in my ears, but there was no sound from the town behind me. No one was there. No one was watching. I reached the Titapools, the very place Nathan had warned me about. The water was still, though the waves had receded far beyond the rocks. The beach was deserted, except for the occasional gull screeching somewhere far off. As I stepped closer to the water's edge, a strange, sickening sensation washed over me. It was as though I was being watched. I looked down at the water, and I swear I saw something. A movement just beneath the surface. I blinked, and it was gone. Only the murky water remained, still and dark. But it didn't feel empty. It felt alive. Something cold brushed against my cheek, and I turned sharply, convinced someone was standing there. But the beach was empty. The town was still silent. I turned and ran back, my heart racing, but the more I tried to move, the slower I became, as if the fog was pulling me back. When I reached the town again, it was like nothing had changed. The streets were empty, the shops closed. The townsfolk had disappeared, their doors locked, the windows shut tight. I felt a presence behind me, and I whirled around. The innkeeper was standing at the edge of the town, watching me. His face was gaunt, hollow-eyed, like someone who had seen too much. I told you, you wouldn't find him, he murmured. What do you mean? I whispered, my voice barely audible. Where is he? Where is Nathan? The innkeeper took a deep breath, his eyes fixed on me, a strange sort of pity in them. It's too late for him now, and it'll be too late for you soon, too. The town doesn't remember the ones it loses to the sea. Not really. And if you're not careful, you'll be forgotten, too. His words echoed in my mind as I watched him retreat into the shadows. The fog crept in further, swallowing the town whole, until it felt as though Black Tide Cove didn't exist anymore. Like it was never there to begin with. I couldn't stay any longer. But where could I go? The sea was waiting for me. I could feel it, and there was nothing, no one who could stop it now. I turned away from the town and looked out toward the ocean. The whispers were faint, but they were there, just beneath the wind. And they were calling my name. The sea never forgets. I woke up the next morning with a strange taste in my mouth. It was salty, like the ocean had somehow seeped into my dreams. But that wasn't the strange part. The strange part was that there was no trace of Nathan Hale anywhere. His room was empty, completely undisturbed. I knew I hadn't heard him leave. The floor was still covered with the imprints of his wet boots from the night before. The window was slightly ajar, but the town's thick fog was rolling in, just like it always did. The innkeeper, a grumpy old man who never spoke much, was up and about earlier than usual. He muttered something under his breath when I mentioned Nathan's disappearance. No one stays here too long, he grumbled, as if it was a standard saying, not a warning. But it wasn't just Nathan's absence that unsettled me. It was the eerie quiet that clung to Black Tide Cove now. I had a sense that things weren't quite right, that something had shifted. I didn't know if it was just the air, or if the town itself had started to feel emptier. I walked past the lighthouse and toward the beach. The salty wind whipped at my face, and for a second, I thought I saw a figure standing in the distance, silhouetted against the rising tide. I blinked hard and looked again. Nothing. The beach was deserted, as it always was at this time of day. No one ever dared come out this far. But when I glanced back at the lighthouse, I saw something strange. The door was wide open, the light inside flickering dimly as though struggling against some unseen force. The keeper never left that light. Never. A chill crawled up my spine, and I turned back to the inn. Something was off. Later that evening, I found myself sitting at the inn's weathered wooden bar, nursing a drink that did little to calm my nerves. The other patrons were avoiding eye contact, staring into their mugs like the world outside didn't exist. I could feel the weight of their silence. The air in the room was heavy, thick with the unspoken. It was as if they all knew something I didn't. I wanted to leave, but I had no choice but to stay. I overheard the innkeeper talking to a man at the end of the bar. His voice was low, like he was sharing some ancient, forbidden truth. "He doesn't know," he said, his voice almost breaking. "He's already gone." The man he spoke to didn't respond, just nodded quietly, as if he had heard this many times before. "Who's gone?" I asked before I could stop myself. The innkeeper looked at me for a long moment, his face creased in that perpetual, unwelcoming frown. His eyes shifted toward the window, the mist outside creeping in. "Does it matter?" he asked finally, his voice like gravel scraping against stone. "People come and go, but the sea takes what it wants." Before I could ask him what he meant, the door creaked open, and the woman I had seen earlier, the one who seemed to know something about Nathan, walked in. Her eyes were wide with something between fear and obsession. She glanced around, as if expecting someone, but her gaze landed on me. Without a word, she sat down next to me, her eyes flicking nervously between the door and the bar. "You're Nathan's friend, right?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. I nodded. "I am. Do you know where he's gone?" She hesitated, then shook her head slowly. "He's not gone. He's here. He's still here watching." I felt my stomach tighten. "What do you mean, watching?" She leaned in closer, the faint smell of salt water in her hair. "You won't see it at first," she murmured, "but they're always here, watching from the edge of the water, waiting." "Who? The drowned ones?" Her voice was barely audible now, drowned beneath the heavy weight of the room. "You're still too new. You don't understand. Nathan wasn't the first. He won't be the last." I stared at her, confusion clouding my mind. "What are you talking about? Who are these drowned ones?" She glanced over her shoulder, as though expecting someone to be standing behind her. "They're not dead. Not quite. They're like shadows, stretching into this world and the next. They call to you from the depths. You can hear it if you listen close enough. You just have to want to hear it." Her words felt like a punch to the gut. "But Nathan was—" She cut me off, her voice sharp. "Nathan was foolish. He thought he could understand it, but no one can. They get inside your mind. The tide doesn't forget those who listen." Before I could say anything more, she stood up and left, her eyes darting nervously between the door and the darkened streets outside. I sat there, frozen, her words echoing in my head. The tide doesn't forget those who listen. The air in the room grew heavier, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I looked around, but no one met my gaze. As I walked back to my room, the mist had thickened, wrapping around the town like a blanket, muffling every sound. But in the silence, I thought I heard something, whispers carried by the wind. My name. I quickened my pace, but the whispers grew louder. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. They were inside me now. I reached my room and slammed the door shut behind me, but the whispers followed. They were coming from everywhere, under the floorboards, from the walls, the ceiling. And then I realized they weren't whispers anymore. They were words. Asterisk, come home. Asterisk. I pressed my hands to my ears, trying to block it out, but the words didn't stop. They only grew louder, and I realized with horror. Asterisk, they were calling me Star. The sea was calling me. I had to get out, but when I turned to run, I saw it. A figure standing in the window. It was Nathan, but his face, his eyes, they were black, empty. He didn't move, didn't blink, just stared. And then I heard it again, the whispering. Asterisk, come home. Asterisk. I didn't know if I was still in my room. I didn't know what was real anymore. But I knew one thing for certain. The sea was closer than I thought. The sun was already sinking low when I saw him. A boy, no older than 10, sitting by the edge of the town's only street, staring out toward the beach. His face was drawn, pale from something deeper than just the cold. It had been like this for days. Quiet, empty streets, everyone locked indoors after sundown, murmuring about the ocean and the things it brings. I had learned to ignore the whispers. At least I tried, but something about the boy caught my attention. His name was Daniel, I'd heard one of the innkeepers say. A quiet thing, just like the rest of them. I'd seen him wandering the streets, but always alone. Always with that same strange look in his eyes, like he was listening to something no one else could hear. He looked back at me, his eyes wide, almost startled. The same look I'd seen in the eyes of the fishermen when they spoke of the sea, of the drowned ones. They all had that same faraway, lost look, like something had taken a piece of them and left them just enough to keep breathing. "Are you okay?" I asked, though I knew it was a foolish question. His lip trembled slightly. For a moment, I thought he might speak, but then he turned back to the ocean, the horizon where the sky blurred into something darker. "They're calling," he whispered, so softly I almost didn't hear him. I took a step closer. "Who's calling?" "The sea," he said, his voice barely a breath. "I hear them. They tell me things." I had heard those whispers too. Late at night when the wind was too still, when the waves seemed to be speaking just under the surface, like the sea was holding its breath. "What do they say?" I asked, though I didn't really want to know. His gaze never left the water. His small fingers gripped the hem of his shirt, as if he were trying to hold on to something real, something solid. "They say I'll join them soon," he muttered. "The drowned ones. They call me." I felt a shiver crawl up my spine. I wanted to tell him it was just a story, that there was no such thing. But I couldn't, not with the way his voice trembled. "I saw them last night," he said, his voice shaking now. "In the water. They were standing there in the tide-pools, watching me. They wanted me to come closer. They kept whispering my name." I stepped back, unable to hide my unease. "Daniel, you have to stay away from the water. It's not real. It's just a legend, a story." But his eyes locked onto mine with such intensity that I almost thought he could see right through me. "They're real," he said softly, almost pleading. "I don't know what they want, but they're real." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. There was no denying it anymore. The whispers weren't just in my head, and the stories I'd heard weren't just old myths. Something in the water called to the people of Blacktide Cove, and it wasn't content with just the forgotten. Without another word, Daniel stood up, his little legs unsteady, and he walked away from me toward the shore. I hesitated, my heart pounding. "Daniel, don't!" He didn't stop. His small form continued toward the tide-pools, his feet leaving deep prints in the wet sand. I was frozen, torn between running to him and staying where I was. I couldn't explain it, but something about the way he walked, the way he was drawn to the water, made my legs feel like lead. Then, as if he felt my gaze, Daniel paused. He turned back toward me, and I saw his face, pale and hollow-eyed, like he was already lost to whatever haunted that place. "They told me to come," he said, "and I'm going to." Before I could move, before I could shout, he stepped into the shallows, his feet sinking into the water. The whispers rose, low and guttural, pulling him in deeper. I could see it then, the shadow beneath the water, moving, reaching for him. I finally found my legs. I ran toward him, my heart thundering in my chest. But just as I reached the edge of the tide-pools, the water surged. The shape that had been lurking beneath the surface vanished. Daniel was gone. The beach was empty. The whispers lingered for a moment longer, then faded, leaving only the sound of the wind. I stood there, staring at the water, feeling the weight of the silence around me. The town had always warned me. The legends, the sea, they had all warned me to stay away from the water after dark. But now it wasn't just a story. I could feel it in my bones. And as I walked back to the inn, I couldn't help but wonder how many others had heard those whispers, and how many had answered them. The town had begun to forget. The rumors that had once buzzed like the bees in spring now lay quiet, just a murmur in the back of people's minds. It wasn't that they wanted to forget, but rather it was safer for their families, for their children, for themselves. And it was easy to do. The mist came in every night, thick as smoke, swallowing everything whole. Faces, voices, memories. In Black Tide Cove, forgetting was as natural as breathing. I was different. My name's Emily, and I wasn't one to forget. I had heard the stories about the girl who disappeared, about the strange lights in the distance, about the sea that never truly let go. So, when I first heard about Nathan Hale, the journalist who came to town seeking answers, I couldn't help but feel a little hope. Maybe someone would finally figure out what was really going on here. But that hope died when I found his room, abandoned and silent. I had come to Black Tide to get away from the city, to write my own story, and the mystery of Nathan's disappearance tugged at my mind like the waves that pounded the rocks on the shore. It felt wrong, too wrong to just let it fade away. I wasn't about to let another man disappear without leaving a mark, especially not when it seemed like the town was so damn good at erasing everything that didn't fit their quiet little world. I stayed at the inn, same as Nathan had. The air was thick with that heavy sea scent, and my footsteps echoed in the hall as I searched through his belongings. His notebook, soaked through with water, lay on the floor by the bed. I flipped through the pages, reading bits and pieces of frantic thoughts that gave me chills. Asterisk, it knows me. It's inside my head. The tide is coming, asterisk. I paused on those last words, heart racing. I didn't understand them, not fully, but they made something deep inside me tremble. That night, I couldn't sleep. The wind howled outside, and I kept hearing strange sounds through the walls, the creaking of wood, the soft rhythm of waves slapping against the shore. But it wasn't the wind. No, it was something else, something that shouldn't be. I left my room in search of answers, out into the thick fog that hugged the town like a secret. The beach looked different at night. The moonlight barely cut through the mist, and the tide seemed unusually low, exposing the dark rocks and strange pools that dotted the shore. I couldn't explain it, but I was drawn to the tidal pools, those water-filled depressions in the rock that everyone warned me to stay away from after sundown. The same tidal pools Nathan had investigated. I approached the water's edge slowly, almost hesitantly, the salty air biting at my skin. Something about the stillness of it all felt wrong. I crouched by the nearest pool, watching the surface of the water. It looked calm at first, nothing more than a mirror reflecting the fog. But then, something shifted in the water. At first, it was just a flicker, a faint movement in the reflection, like something passing just beneath the surface. I blinked and rubbed my eyes, thinking it was the mist playing tricks on me. But when I looked again, I saw it clearly. There was someone in the water, not a figure standing above the surface, but a reflection, my own reflection, but wrong. The woman staring back at me had a twisted smile on her face, one that wasn't mine. Her eyes were wide open, too wide, and she was smiling, grinning like a madwoman, like she knew something I didn't. I gasped and stumbled back, heart pounding in my chest. But when I looked up, the world around me was still the same. Nothing had changed. The beach, the mist, the rocks. Everything was just as it had been before. I turned back to the tidal pool, hands trembling, the reflection still staring at me. But now it wasn't just my reflection I saw. There were more faces, more shapes, all staring back at me with those same hollow eyes. I stumbled back, almost falling over the rocks as I scrambled to get away. My heart hammered in my chest, and I had to fight against the urge to scream, to run, to leave. But something kept me rooted to the spot. Something whispered to me from the water, soft at first, almost too quiet to hear. But then it grew louder, like the sound of 1,000 voices, 1,000 desperate pleas. Asterisk, come back to us. Asterisk. I couldn't breathe. My feet moved on their own, dragging me closer to the pool again. My head was spinning, but my body couldn't stop moving. The voices were inside my head now, pulling me in. I blinked, and for a moment, I thought I saw Nathan, his face covered in salt water, staring at me from the pool. The reflection was no longer just mine. It was theirs too. And for the first time, I realized I was part of it now. I didn't know how much time passed before I came to my senses and ran, my legs burning as I pushed myself away from the tidal pools. But I couldn't escape the feeling that something was following me, something in the fog, just beyond my vision waiting. I never went back to the tidal pools, but I could feel them, all of them, watching, waiting. And I knew, deep down, the sea was never done with me. It never was. The storm came like a warning from the sea, silent at first, then suddenly furious. It rattled the windows of the old inn where I stayed, making the building groan like it was alive. I could hear the wind howling outside, tugging at the wooden beams, whispering through the cracks in the walls. But there was something else in the storm, something I couldn't quite place. Like the air was filled with a tension, a waiting. I had been in Black Tide Cove for weeks by then, trying to piece together the town's dark history, but I was no closer to understanding it. The people here, they seemed to know something I didn't. They were always watching me, silent, cautious. When I asked about the lighthouse keeper, their faces grew tight, like they were afraid of even speaking his name. But I wasn't afraid. Not yet. I had heard the stories, how the lighthouse keeper was the only one who still cared about keeping the light on, even when everyone else had given up. How he was the last one standing between the town and the sea, though some said he'd been there too long, that he was too close to it all. That was why, after days of searching for answers, I decided to visit him myself. I walked down the narrow path toward the lighthouse, just as the first heavy raindrops started to fall. The air felt thick like it was pressing down on my chest. The wind had picked up, and the sky had darkened to a bruise-colored gray. The lighthouse, towering over the cliffs like a sentinel, loomed ahead. I couldn't see much of it through the fog, but I could hear the distant hum of the light turning, sweeping across the sea in slow, steady arcs. As I got closer, I noticed something strange. The door to the lighthouse was ajar, swinging gently in the wind. That was odd. The keeper was always meticulous about locking up, or so I had heard. I hesitated for a moment, listening to the storm battering the coast, the waves crashing against the rocks far below. There was a sound in the wind that made my skin crawl, like something was calling out to me. I stepped inside. The air in the lighthouse smelled old, salt, rust, and something heavier, something faintly decayed. The stairs creaked under my feet as I climbed up to the lantern room. The light was dim, casting strange shadows that stretched across the walls. The keeper wasn't there. I called out, but my voice was swallowed by the storm. Hello. My voice felt small in the vastness of the lighthouse. No answer. I moved deeper into the room, my eyes scanning the space. The floor was damp, as if the storm had seeped in through cracks in the stone. I could see the keeper's coat draped over a chair, still wet from the rain. His boots were placed neatly beside it, the mud caked on them still fresh. But there was no sign of the man himself. A shiver crawled down my spine as I turned to face the lantern, the source of the light. The glass was smeared, like it had been touched recently. But it wasn't just the glass. Something else had been left behind. In the thick layer of dust on the floor, I noticed footprints, wet, dark prints that seemed to lead out of the room. They stopped abruptly, as if whoever made them had vanished. I froze. My heart skipped a beat, the air growing colder, heavier. There was no sound now, just the distant rush of the waves below, the storm pressing in. The whispers, soft and faint, almost drowned out by the storm, seemed to grow louder. I stepped cautiously to the edge of the balcony, peering over the railing down into the abyss below. That's when I saw it, the lighthouse keeper's coat. It was flapping against the wind, hanging from a rock just beneath the cliffs, as though it had been tossed there carelessly. But it wasn't just a coat. There was something else, his boots. They lay on the ground beside it, the soles facing up, empty. The sea was rising, swallowing the shore below. I wanted to turn away, but I couldn't. My feet felt like they were rooted to the ground, my mind racing. He hadn't fallen. He hadn't been swept away by the storm. He had walked to the edge. Then a voice whispered through the wind, so soft I almost missed it. Asterisk, it's too late now. Asterisk. I spun around, but no one was there. I didn't know if I should stay or run. The air felt like it was closing in on me, the storm growing louder, the sea more restless. Something was coming, something that had taken the keeper and now wanted me. I stumbled back down the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. As I reached the door, I heard it again, louder this time. Asterisk, you shouldn't have come. Asterisk. The door slammed shut behind me, and I ran without looking back. I couldn't get back to the town fast enough. I didn't see the lighthouse keeper again, but I knew he was gone. He had joined them, those drowned souls, lost to the sea. And now, the whispers were for me. I don't know what it is about Black Tide Cove that pulls you back, but I couldn't stay away. Maybe it's the silence, the weight of the place pressing in on your chest. Or maybe it's just the call of something unseen, something waiting for you in the mist. Either way, here I am, walking down a street slick with rain, a storm swallowing the town whole. I can hear the sea, always that deep, throaty growl, like it's alive, stretching itself across the horizon. The tide is out, revealing the rocky shore, the kind that seems to groan underfoot when you step on it. The mist hangs so thick you can barely see past the end of your nose, but something tells me that I'm not alone. I don't know when it happened, but somehow I ended up back at the Tittapools. I tried to avoid them. I really did. After everything that had happened, after Nathan, God, poor Nathan, I don't even know where to begin with him anymore. But that thing was calling to me again. I tried to ignore it, but there it was thick in my bones. The whispers. You hear them if you listen long enough. They start faint like a hum on the wind, but soon they're too close, too sharp. It's a voice familiar but not quite. You know it's not your own, but it sounds like it's been there your whole life. I stand at the edge of the Tittapools now, the water level lower than I've ever seen before. It's eerily quiet, the usual crash of waves distant, muffled, almost like the sea's holding its breath. I can't help but move closer, my feet dragging through the wet sand, my eyes locked on the shapes that start to form beneath the water. I don't know how long I stood there, but I could feel them watching. It's like they know you're here before you even see them. And then I saw them. Figures. Slow, deliberate movements under the water, pale hands breaking the surface. It wasn't just a mist. They were walking toward me. The things I'd heard about, the drowned ones. And there, among them, was Nathan. I froze. It was him. His face was different, but it was him. His eyes. Asterisk, God, asterisk. Those eyes, black and hollow, staring into mine like they had been waiting for me. His clothes were soaked, hanging off him like he'd been pulled out of the sea itself. He didn't speak. He didn't move, except for that one thing, the way he looked at me. That look, like he was trying to tell me something. No, not trying, like he needed me to understand. I could feel the air around me thicken, the whispers turning into words. They were all around me now, filling my head, pushing out everything else. I couldn't even breathe without hearing them. Come home. Nathan's voice didn't sound like his own. It was deeper, hollow, distant, almost drowned out by the tide. Come home. The sea echoed, like it had been waiting for me all this time. I could almost taste the salt in my mouth, feel the cold water rising at my feet. Asterisk, they're all here. You've always been one of us. It's time, asterisk. My heart pounded in my chest, and I stumbled back, my foot slipping in the wet sand. The figures didn't stop moving. They just kept walking toward me, the water rising faster, too fast. The voices, they were so close now, like they were inside me, choking me with their weight. It wasn't just the sea pulling at my feet anymore. Something else was happening, something that had been happening for years and years. I couldn't move. I couldn't run. I couldn't breathe. The tide was coming in, but it wasn't the tide anymore. It was them, all of them, reaching for me. And then I realized they weren't just waiting for me. They were calling. But there was something else too, something more. I saw the shapes around me, their faces growing clearer, their bodies more defined with each passing second. I saw people I knew, old fishermen, travelers, people who had disappeared. And I saw someone else, someone new. It wasn't Nathan this time. It was me. I blinked, and there I was, staring back at myself from the dark waters, my face pale, my eyes wide with horror. It wasn't a reflection. No, this was something different. The water was moving, pulling me closer, as if the sea had been waiting for me too. My hand reached out toward the reflection, toward myself, and I could feel the coldness of it, the emptiness, the pull. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the water rose up and swallowed everything whole. I never meant to stay this long. When I first arrived in Black Tide Cove, It was supposed to be a quick visit. I was here for the stories. Those strange, unsettling tales that people only whisper about in small towns. The legends of the drowned ones, the mysterious disappearances, the old lighthouse. It seemed like the perfect material for my next article. But now I understand why no one speaks of it aloud. The town is a ghost, even though it's full of people. It doesn't change. It never changes. People come, people go, but the whispers always remain. I've seen it all firsthand, heard the voices no one talks about, felt the water pulling at my legs even when I wasn't near the beach. I was foolish to think I could come here and simply write it off as superstition. Maybe there's a part of me that wished it was all a lie, but as the tide keeps rising, I realize it wasn't. I stood on the edge of the pier last night, staring out at the dark expanse of water. It was low tide. I could see the sand stretching out like a mouth waiting for the sea to pull everything back under. I could feel the weight of it, the pressure of the ocean, as if it was aware of me. I think it's always been aware of me. The townsfolk, they don't look at me the same anymore. Not after what happened to Nathan Hale. Not after what I saw, what I heard. I tried to ask questions, tried to get anyone to tell me the truth, but they all just turned away. Even the innkeeper, who had been so eager to talk when I first arrived, gave me nothing now. A blank stare. A quick excuse to go inside. I remember the look in her eyes. There's a fear there. Not the kind you get from ghosts or monsters. No, it's a deeper fear. The kind you get when you know something is inevitable, when you can't escape it. I sat with her once, during the storm last week. She poured me tea, her hands shaking as she did. I didn't ask about Nathan Hale, though I wanted to. I didn't ask about the missing girl, Eliza. I didn't have to. The air between us was thick with something unspoken, like the moment before a thunderclap. She finally broke the silence, and I'll never forget what she said. The sea doesn't forget. It remembers all those who come too close. I didn't know what she meant at the time, but I do now. The people here have learned to live with the fear. They avoid the beach at night. They avoid the cliffs, the tidipools. They've learned to ignore the whispers, the cold spots on the beach, the shadowy figures standing just beyond the water's edge. They know the cost of curiosity, the cost of asking too many questions. There's a rule here now. Don't go near the tidipools after dusk. It wasn't always that way. Before Nathan Hale, before the storm, before all the disappearances, they used to wander. They used to wonder. But now they know. The wind kicked up last night, rattling the windows in my room, but I couldn't sleep. I knew it was time. The tide had pulled back again, exposing the rocks and the sand beneath. I stood at the window, staring out into the blackness of the sea. I thought I heard something, a voice. It could have been the wind, but then it came again, soft, insistent. Come closer. I don't know if I'm ready to tell anyone this, but it's been eating at me. The whispers aren't just sounds anymore. They're thoughts. They're mine. I hear them in my head when I close my eyes, and when I wake up, they're still there. It's like I've become a part of the sea, and the sea a part of me. I've heard people say the drowned ones call to you when they want you to join them. But what if it's not just a call? What if it's more than that? What if we're not meant to hear them at all? I don't know how much longer I can stay. My heart keeps racing, the air feels thicker every time I breathe, and when I look into the water now, I see them. The town keeps its distance. They say they're doing it for my safety, but I know better now. They're not protecting me. They're protecting themselves. I'm the one who's trapped now. I look out at the water one last time before I leave. I see a figure standing at the shore, just past the tidipools where the shadows play. The moonlight cuts through the mist, revealing it for only a moment. It's watching me, and I can feel the whispers inside me again. This time, I don't fight it. Come closer. I hear it clear as day now, and I know it's not the sea anymore. It's me. Tomorrow I leave, but I can already feel the tide coming in, and I know, just like Nathan Hale, just like Eliza, that I'll never truly escape. The sea keeps its promises, and it always gets what it wants. I couldn't leave, even though the whispers had grown louder, even though my heart raced at every low tide, even though I knew what awaited me. I stayed. Something in me had already given in. There was no escape from Black Tide Cove. The sea had already claimed me the moment I set foot here. I woke up on my last morning in the inn, but it didn't feel like morning. The sun barely peered through the mist, and the air was thick, cloying. I had packed my bags, ready to leave, but my feet wouldn't carry me out the door. They stayed planted. I couldn't breathe, couldn't focus. My mind was elsewhere, consumed by something that had been growing inside me for days. An understanding. The sea had been watching me, but it wasn't just Nathan or Eliza or the others who were lost. It was the town itself. Black Tide Cove wasn't a place for people. It was a place for memories, for the lost souls who wandered in and never returned. The sea had claimed the entire town, and its power kept them rooted here. It kept me here. I looked out of the window again, staring at the endless, shifting horizon. The tide was pulling back, revealing more of the beach, more of the rocks, more of the things hidden beneath the surface. And that's when I saw it. Nathan's face. Not just in the mist, not just in the water, but in the reflection of the window. His eyes, wide and vacant, staring back at me. A whisper followed. Asterisk, it's time. Asterisk. I didn't scream. I couldn't. I had heard that voice before, deep within me. The sea was calling me, calling us, and there was no turning back. I rushed to the door, but it slammed shut before I could touch the handle. The innkeeper, now a shadow of herself, appeared in the doorway. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow. "You knew," I whispered. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her gaze shifted to the window, where the tide was pulling back farther, revealing the full moon now reflecting on the water. I turned, realizing what she was telling me. I had been chosen. It wasn't a warning anymore. It was a fact. The Titapool whispered again, louder now, as though it was inside my head. Asterisk, come closer. Asterisk. I stumbled toward the door, and the innkeeper finally spoke. "It's your turn now. Don't fight it. It's always been your turn." I hesitated, only for a moment. But it was enough. The waves surged, the wind howled, and the ground beneath my feet felt soft like it was shifting. I stepped outside, numb to the cold, my legs moving on their own. As I neared the shore, I saw them. Figures, more than I had ever seen before. Nathan, Eliza, the fisherman, the lighthouse keeper, all of them. They stood in the shallow waters, waiting. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Their eyes, blank and empty, spoke louder than words ever could. The sea had taken them, and now it was taking me. I walked into the water, feeling the cold seeping through my clothes. My feet sank into the soft, wet sand, the water creeping up to my knees, to my waist, to my chest. It was as if the ocean was swallowing me whole. The figures stepped forward, their eyes locked on mine. And then nothing. I was weightless. The sea was all around me, inside me. I felt no fear, no pain, just the slow, steady pull of the tide, drawing me further into its depths. In the distance, I could hear the town, but it was fading now, just a memory. The whispers had stopped, and in their place was a calm, a strange peace. The drowned ones were no longer figures to fear, but companions. We were all the same now. I was part of the sea, and Black Tide Cove would never be forgotten.